This video is about a book that I've been working on for the last 4 years, and it's about China in the 1930s and an American writer called George Cates who lived there for 7 years in a courtyard house in the old part of Beijing, and he wrote a famous memoir called The Years That Were Fat, and that was published in 1952, and it's been quite a successful book, and I think he has quite a big following. So I'm hoping that this book will be of interest to those people that are familiar with George Cates, and also I hope to a new generation of readers who have not heard of him and are not familiar with the subject.
So how did you get involved in writing this book?
Well, I first came to know about Cates when I first went to China in 2006, and I heard about his book, and when I got back to America I found it and read it, and it was very interesting. And the thing about it was that basically there was no other information out there on the internet, or nobody had written a biography of him, so I kind of got into doing my own research with some encouragement from other people, and it kind of started from that, really.
So what is remarkable about the 1930s in Beijing?
Yeah, the 1930s in Beijing is a really interesting period because for several reasons. First of all, it was a period where there was a lot of openness, and China and Beijing were accessible to Westerners in a way that they had not been in the 19th century, and they were not to be again after 1949 under the People's Republic. It was a period of where there was a lot of beautiful architecture. Beijing obviously being the imperial capital, there was a tremendous amount of wonderful architecture that was really well preserved at that stage. And the culture, the traditional culture, the sort of Confucian culture, the culture that embodied Taoism and Confucianism and Buddhism, was still in place. And again, after 1949, that all changed. So I think the combination of those factors made it a very interesting place to visit, and it's sort of a very interesting place to learn about.
Why is George Cates' book special?
His book is special, I think, for a couple of reasons. One is that he really got involved in the culture in a way that most other Westerners at the time did not, or I should say to a greater extent. He lived in a courtyard house in Beijing. He learned Chinese very thoroughly, and he sort of lived the life of a Chinese scholar. So he had an advantage over most Westerners in that he saw things that they didn't see. And he also was a very good observer. He'd spent his early years studying European culture. He went to Harvard, he had a PhD from Oxford, and so he was a particularly sort of shrewd observer. And so he used those two things to his advantage, and when he wrote The Years That Were Fat, he was able to put everything together in a very charming and interesting way. So you get to see the best of Beijing presented in a really interesting way.
What is special about George Cates as a person in his career and in his life?
Yeah, he's an interesting guy. First of all, he had a very long life. He lived to the age of 95, and he lived through basically sort of the whole 20th century. He was involved in the First War. He was an officer in France for the American Army. He was involved in the Second World War. He worked for the intelligence service in China from 1942 to 1945. As I say, he was a highly educated man. He sort of grew up in the Edwardian period in a wealthy family. He was a smart guy who went to the best schools, and he just he had an interesting perspective on things, and he was an independent scholar, and he didn't have a particular agenda, and the things that he studied were what he wanted to study and what he was interested in. So I think that's reflected in his book, and hopefully I reflected that in my book too.
So what kind of people were living in the Beijing expat community in the 1930s?
Yeah, in the 1930s there were an interesting sort of group of foreigners who made their home there. There were diplomats who were there because the diplomatic quarter was in Beijing. There were missionaries there were many missionaries in China at that time trying to convert people, and so there was a missionary community. There were business people who were trying to capitalize on the openness of Chinese society and bring Western business to China. There were academics who worked at Chinese universities, and then there were a group of sort of independent people who were either independently wealthy and just enjoyed living there, or they were like Kate's and they sort of came there to sort of study the culture. So it was a very interesting group of people, an eclectic group, but this was obviously before the time of aeroplane travel, before the time of plane travel, and so the people who went there really had to want to be there, because it was still fairly remote and a little bit difficult to get to.
Did other people write about life in the 1930s in Beijing?
Yes, they did. A number of the people who were in China in the 1930s wrote memoirs or accounts of various aspects of living in Beijing. I think they had a sense that this was a special time, and what they were experiencing was a special thing, and it was, because it was something that couldn't have been experienced before by Westerners. And then once the Second World War came along and then the revolution, everything changed. So there are a number of actually quite good accounts out there written by people who were living there at the same time as Kate's in the 1930s.
What is remarkable or different about Kate's book?
Yeah, Kate's book is the best. I think most people, I certainly think so, I think most people would agree. His is the best memoir of the period. And the reason that it's the best is it's not sort of a boring, dry, historical or political account of what happened at that period of time. It's very much a first-hand account of it's what we would now maybe would call like a travel, an account of someone's travels. As I explained earlier, he was so much more involved in the culture than most Westerners, that he got to see things that other people didn't see. And then that, combined with the fact that he was sort of an astute observer, and he'd spent a lot of time studying aesthetics and the arts, he really developed an appreciation of Chinese culture that was unusual for a Westerner. And being a Westerner, he was able to communicate that well to a Western audience. And he's a very, very good writer, a better writer than most people. So he was able to put together a rather charming account that, although it includes details of what he was doing, it's not sort of egotistical. It's a balanced book, and a more interesting book than the other books that are out there, even though some of those are quite good.
All right. In the course of your research, what did you find out about Kate's, and where did you find it?
Yeah, I was fortunate when I started this project that there were actually materials out there that could significantly enhance an understanding of, or from which one could get an understanding of George Kate's and his life, including his life in China. And that had nothing to do with me. That was just the fact that he'd written a lot of letters during his life, and people had the foresight to keep those letters, and so those letters now exist in a number of archives in American museums, and also in some of Kate's papers from his from when he died. So there's a tremendous amount of material there, and that provided a lot of insight and additional information on his life, including his life in China. I guess what I found was that he's an interesting guy. I mean, he worked in Hollywood in the 1920s. He was involved in literary projects in the 40s and 50s, and he's just a very interesting guy. And I found out quite a lot of additional material about his time in China. I also have had the benefit of help from a number of other scholars, who, particularly Fergus Bordewick, who've interviewed people that knew Cates and Cates himself while they were still alive. And also I've been to China several times to try to find his house and the other places that he enjoyed visiting in Beijing.
So what do you think you have conveyed in your book?
Well, what I hope I've conveyed in my book is I guess, sort of an extension of what George Cates wrote about, more about his life, obviously a lot more about his life before and after he was in Beijing, but sort of the inside story, if you will, about his life in China. And I've tried to weave in and bring in some of the perspectives of other people to give sort of a balanced view of what was going on. And hopefully a clear impression of what this person was like, what motivated him, what was important to him, what he achieved in China, and sort of what his legacy has been. And I think it's an interesting story.
What do you think you have added to the study of Old Beijing?
Well, I hope I've added something. I think just the fact of getting into more of this original material, these letters and other notes and materials that Cates left when he died, I think gives an additional insight into that period. And I think hopefully the weaving together and the comparison of Cates's material with those and views with those of other people, I think is hopefully useful. I've also spent quite a bit of time on the ground in Beijing, so I hope perhaps a fresh perspective on that period in time, and I guess sort of a weaving together of the accounts of different people who were in Beijing during the 1930s. So I think it's something that people will be interested in.